Under the project prepared in the spring of 1933, it was planned to create a combat vehicle weighing between 11 and 13,000 pounds, with armor thickness of about 1.2 inches. The most interesting feature of the design was that the hull had a cast construction. It was assembled with bolts from several parts, which made it more advantageous compared to the typical French tank constructions of that period, assembled with rails and rivets. To reduce weight, the tank had no turret, like tankettes. The commander, who also served as the machine gunner, sat to the right of the driver. It was quite a budget-friendly replacement for the old Renault FT, the situation with which was becoming increasingly critical. The Armament Advisory Council, which was the main supervisory body on this matter, approved the Hotchkiss design. On June 30, 1933, a contract was signed with Hotchkiss for the production of 3 experimental prototypes of the tank. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, competitors quickly learned about it, especially Renault. As a result, on August 2nd, a competition was announced with tactical and technical requirements that almost repeated Ainsworth's tank. According to these requirements, it was planned to produce a 2-man tank with a combat weight of about 13,000 pounds, with armor about 1.2 inches thick, and armament consisting either of 2 machine guns or a 37mm SA-18 gun. Unlike the Hotchkiss proposal, this vehicle was to have a turret, and the average speed was required to be between 5 and 6 miles per hour. In total, 14 companies participated in the competition, but in reality, far fewer proceeded to actual construction. One way or another, tanks were built by 6 firms: Hotchkiss, Renault, Delaunay-Belleville, Compagnie Générale de Construction de Locomotives, also known as Batignolles-Châtillon, Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, abbreviated FCM, and Atelier de Puteaux, abbreviated APX. However, on May 22, 1934, the Infantry Command revised the specification into a light infantry support tank. According to the new version, the armor thickness increased to about 1.6 inches, since protection was now required against the fire of the 25mm Hotchkiss gun. The machine gun armament option was abandoned, and the maximum speed was increased to between 9 and 12 miles per hour. The change in requirements affected all participants of the competition. Furthermore, funding was reduced to 4 manufacturers, excluding Hotchkiss. Funds for prototype construction were allocated to Renault, Delaunay-Belleville, Batignolles-Châtillon, and FCM. Renault quickly became the competition favorite. Using the previously mentioned Renault VM tank as a base, the company developed the Renault ZM prototype. Like the Hotchkiss design, this vehicle featured a cast hull construction. In December 1934, Renault ZM entered trials, which largely worked in Renault's favor. The experimental turretless Hotchkiss tank entered trials only on January 18, 1935. Like the Renault ZM, the tank significantly exceeded the specified weight. Instead of 6 tons, it weighed over 17,000 pounds. In reality, things were not as bad as they might have seemed. The focus should have been on the chassis rather than the whole tank. The vehicle was powered by a 6-cylinder engine with a displacement of slightly less than 1 gallon and an output of 75 horsepower. It was noticeably more compact than Renault's 85 horsepower engine. The suspension proved successful. Each side had 6 road wheels grouped into 3 bogies using horizontally mounted springs as elastic elements. It somewhat resembled the Horseman suspension. Thanks to the front-mounted transmission, the vehicle turned out compact. The most important part, however, was the test results. Indeed, the Renault ZM appeared more advanced, but the Hotchkiss tank was faster by 6 to 7 miles per hour. On April 29, 1935, the Renault ZM was officially adopted into service under the designation Light Tank Model 1935 IR. The Infantry Command's decision in favor of the Renault ZM was entirely understandable. This tank had appeared earlier, featured a more powerful engine, and was initially lighter than its competitors. But then came the nuances. First, the turret mounted on it came from another machine, a tank developed by APX. Second, despite its flaws, the 2 experimental Hotchkiss prototypes proved faster. Third, Hotchkiss did not give up. Although the Renault tank was accepted into service, the engineers at Saint-Denis pushed on, and by August 1935, a 3rd experimental prototype was ready. It was significantly improved, featuring a more compact engine deck, The driver's position moved to the right, and most importantly, the same APX turret. During tests in August and September 1935, the tank proved that it was clearly not inferior to the Renault design, and in terms of speed, even surpassed it. However, the infantry had already made its choice. Moreover, their attention was shifting toward the FCM Traktur RN3, a tank with a progressive welded hull, rational armor angles, and a diesel engine. The infantry did not need two similar tanks. It seemed that everything had ended there. But then something happened that Hotchkiss likely did not expect, and much of it was due to their main competitors. As mentioned earlier, Renault had created a cavalry tank known as the Renault VM, or AMR 33 VM. This vehicle was officially classified as a reconnaissance armored car and went into serial production. However, the cavalry was not particularly satisfied with the results. The machine performed poorly off-road due to improper weight distribution. As a result, work began on an improved version called the Renault ZT. In this reconnaissance tank, engineers took into account the experience gained from developing the Renault ZM. In fact, it used the same engine and a similar suspension. On May 17, 1934, a contract was signed to produce 100 reconnaissance tanks, designated AMR 35 ZT. By December 1, 1934, they planned to deliver 10 tanks, followed by 25 units each month. In reality, production only began in 1935 and at a much slower pace than stipulated in the contract. Another drawback was that the average speed of the tank was only 25 miles per hour, which was not particularly impressive. Meanwhile, a heavier tank, the AMC Combat Armored Car, was being developed by the company Somua. Their AC-3 model was an advanced vehicle. Its hull design partly borrowed from Hotchkiss, but the machine turned out to be twice as heavy and much larger. It was also significantly more expensive, costing almost 1 million francs, roughly the price of 5 Renault R35 tanks. Thus, in the autumn of 1935, Brigadier General Jean Flavigny, commander of the French cavalry, began searching for an alternative, and not with Renault, whose production was overloaded with orders and progressing poorly, but elsewhere. In this situation, the Hotchkiss tank turned out to be the optimal candidate. On one hand, it seemed unsuited for cavalry use. On the other, they had ordered the Renault YR armored car, which had an average speed of only 17 miles per hour and offered significantly less armor protection than the Hotchkiss. In short, it was a case of better than nothing. In November 1935, a contract was signed for the production of 200 units of the light tank model 1935. This tank, however, became known under another name, the Hotchkiss H35. And so, the company that had returned to the automobile market only 9 years earlier managed to push aside the giants of French tank manufacturing. As is often the case, before launching a large-scale production series, some refinement was required. It was implemented on one of the tanks. Now, the vehicle fully met the requirements set by the French Infantry Command. The thickness of its armor protection increased to 1.6 inches, which theoretically allowed the tank to withstand fire from 25mm guns. As a result, the combat weight reached 23,300 pounds. Because of this, the maximum speed was 17 miles per hour. Not much at first glance, but compared to the Renault R35, which could only reach 12 miles per hour, the difference was significant. In fact, the Vickers MKE and T26 had only slightly higher top speeds, but in terms of armor protection, they were clearly inferior. Essentially, the Hotchkiss H35 had two major problems: a single-seat turret and the 37mm SA-18 gun. At the time of its adoption into service, this did not seem critical. Moreover, the AMR 35 ZT was even more poorly armed, and a typical tank of that era had only bullet-resistant armor, which the SA-18 could easily penetrate. And as for the single-seat turret, it was by no means uncommon on light tanks. The Germans could certainly confirm that. As a result of the modifications, the outcome was, if not an entirely new tank, then at least a heavily redesigned one. Essentially, only the tracks remained unchanged, and even that is questionable. The running gear was thoroughly reworked, though the general concept of the original prototypes was retained. Test results showed that the road wheels turned out to be too small, so their diameter was increased to 15.7 inches, like on the Renault R35. Due to this increase, the bogies had to be redesigned. They became larger, and their attachment points to the hull were made less massive. The number of return rollers was reduced to 2 per side, the drive sprocket's diameter was increased, and the idler wheel was also changed. As later events showed, this redesign turned out to be very timely. The Hotchkiss H35 got rid of a number of problems that had plagued the Renault R35 on soft ground. The hull also underwent a whole series of changes. Initially, its upper part consisted of 3 segments: the nose section, the turret box, originally the fighting compartment, and the engine deck. Now, the nose and the turret box were merged into a single unit. The driver's compartment was completely redesigned. Initially, the driver had a vision hatch with a small opening built into it, as well as hatches on the left and right sides. In the new version, the driver received a 2-leaf hatch through which he could enter his position. The side vision hatches were replaced by vision slits covered with glass blocks. The design of the engine deck was also changed, which made access to the components easier and increased the reliability of the parts. The structure of the lower hull became more rational as well. It consisted of 4 main elements: the front plate, the sides, and the rear. The side joints no longer protruded outward. Unlike the Renault R35, which had rolled steel sides, the Hotchkiss H35 used cast sides with only the bottom made from rolled plates. The floor consisted of 3 bolted sections. In principle, with such a construction, it was possible to assemble 1 complete hull from 2 damaged ones. The APXR turret was inherited from the Renault R35 tank. One could say they chose the best of the worst, and not only because of the armament it carried. The installation of a 37mm SA-35 gun, paired with a 7.5mm Mac Mil 1931 machine gun, turned out to be unsuccessful. The problem was that the gun mantlet was internal rather than external, which meant there was a risk of it jamming. It should be noted that the Germans had no better results with their light tanks, even without considering the difference in armor thickness. The situation with visibility was also far from ideal. Theoretically, there were plenty of observation devices, one at the front, one on the left, one on the right, plus a vision cupola. But the optical devices themselves were rather poor, and the cupola offered a very narrow field of view. It was no coincidence that the Germans removed it on captured tanks, as it turned out to be of little use. In travel mode, the commander sat on the hatch lid, while in combat, as with the Renault FT, something resembling a strap was used instead. Inside the tank, space was quite cramped, though that depends on what you compare it to. Those who speak of the terrible tightness of French light tanks have clearly never sat inside British 4-ton export tanks, especially the VCL M1937. That was truly fun, particularly for the commander, who was also the gunner and loader at the same time. From the driver's point of view, the comfort level was quite acceptable for light tanks of that period. And in terms of visibility, there was certainly nothing to complain about. In travel position, there was a flap that lifted upward, while in combat mode, 3 vision devices were used, 1 in front and 2 on the sides. Of course, the PZKPFWI had slightly better visibility thanks to its vision hatches. But for a light tank of the mid-30s, the Hotchkiss H35 had entirely decent visibility. The Hotchkiss company did not delay the production of tanks. In the summer of 1936, manufacturing began, and by July, tanks were already being delivered to cavalry units. Soon, the order was increased to 300 vehicles. Thus, it was decided to supply the light mechanized divisions equally with Hotchkiss H35 and Saumur S35 tanks. This turned out to be very bad news for Renault. The expansion of the contract came at the cost of a significant reduction in the AMR 35 ZT tank production program. As a result, the tank rejected by the infantry displaced the cavalry tank. And it cannot be said that the cavalry command was wrong. In fact, by the beginning of the Second World War, the AMR 35 ZT had almost no combat value. Even Soviet reconnaissance tanks were more useful, as they could swim. Meanwhile, this vehicle's characteristics placed it roughly on par with a light armored car. The problem for Renault was not only the quality of the Hotchkiss H35 itself. Another unpleasant surprise was the sudden appearance of a manufacturer capable of quickly fulfilling contracts. To understand the scale, 300 tanks were delivered between July 1936 and November 1937. In other words, Hotchkiss proved to be a far more diligent contractor. Against this backdrop, Renault looked extremely weak. especially considering that in 1936 the company was threatened with bankruptcy, which forced the nationalization of its tank production. The former Renault factory in Issy-les-Moulineaux was renamed AMX. At the same time, the APX tank production facility in Rueil-Malmaison was also nationalized and renamed ARL. Meanwhile, Hotchkiss continued to expand its military production. For example, Lafley tractors were equipped with engines from Saint-Denis, and later, 3-axle Lafley models were produced at Hotchkiss factories. As a result of these developments, the French Infantry Command became interested in the Hotchkiss H35 tank. This happened against the backdrop of problems faced by the Renault R35 during movement on soft ground. In this respect, the running gear of the Hotchkiss H35 proved superior. As a result, 100 tanks were ordered, with deliveries beginning in September 1938. However, the matter was not only about Hotchkiss's promptness or the tank's more successful design. The reasons were also purely economic. Having such a tank in reserve allowed the French infantry to put financial pressure on Renault, which then became more compliant. As a result, 60,000 francs were cut from the cost of each new R35 tank, a considerable sum to say the least. Infantry tanks, as well as later production vehicles, were equipped with more advanced observation devices. Initially, it was assumed that the light mechanized divisions being formed by General Flavigny would be armed with Saumur S35 combat armored cars, as well as AMR reconnaissance vehicles, the AMR 33VM and AMR 35 ZT. But practice turned out differently. Saumur S35 tanks only began to arrive at the end of 1937, and the situation with the AMR tanks became clear as early as 1936. They did arrive, but only in a thin trickle, especially the AMR 35 ZT, which were supplied between 1936 and 1938. Against this backdrop, the decision to purchase the Hotchkiss H35 was the only correct one. The company from Saint-Denis proved to be a much more reliable manufacturer than Renault. Saumur needed some time to get up to speed, although their creation was incomparably better as a tank. The first new tanks in 1937 were received by the 4th Cuirassier Regiment, which had existed since the middle of the 17th century. Until 1936, this regiment was known as the 4th Armored Car Group. It was equipped with half-track armored cars, AMC Schneider, P16, and AMR 33 VM. The latter were taken away, and 47 Hotchkiss H35 tanks were issued instead, while the half-tracked vehicles were later replaced with 48 Saumur S35 tanks. A similar situation occurred with the 18th Dragoon Regiment, which also had a long history dating back to 1744. That same year, 1937, it received 47 Hotchkiss H35 tanks, and later its armored cars were replaced with 48 Saumur S35 tanks as well. In July 1937, the formation of the 2nd Light Mechanized Division began, using units from the 5th Cavalry Division. The 13th Dragoon Regiment and the 29th Dragoon Regiment received the same equipment, 47 Hotchkiss H35 tanks and 48 Saumur S35 tanks each. At the same time, the light tanks arrived earlier than the combat armored vehicles. Thus, the two divisions received 188 tanks, which were precisely the machines designated under the first contract signed in November 1935. An additional batch of 100 tanks was needed to equip the units that were part of the light cavalry divisions. This was a forced measure since Renault ACG-1 tanks had been planned for them, but, as usual, something went wrong. To understand the scale of the problem, as of May 1940, not a single one of the 47 available vehicles of this type was listed in service. Therefore, the 1st Armored Car Regiment of the 1st Light Cavalry Division, the 2nd Armored Car Regiment of the 2nd Light Cavalry Division, and the 3rd Armored Car Regiment of the 3rd Light Cavalry Division each included 16 Hotchkiss H35 tanks, in total 48 vehicles. In addition, 23 tanks went to the 11th Motorized Dragoon Regiment, which was part of the 6th Light Mechanized Brigade of the 3rd Light Mechanized Division. Another 17 tanks were in training units and reserve. Finally, 16 tanks were sent to the 1st Regiment of African Hunters stationed in Rabat, Morocco. Thus, a total of 10 squadrons were formed. Each regiment of the light mechanized divisions had 2 squadrons. and these tanks were distributed among them. Tanks ordered by the French infantry began to arrive in 1939. The first to receive them was the 505th Tank Regiment, on the basis of which, before the start of the Second World War, battalions of combat tanks began to form. Among them was the 13th Tank Battalion, established on the 2nd of September, 1939. According to the battalion's official table of organization, it received 45 Hotchkiss H35 tanks. The same fate awaited the second group of tanks. In the 509th Tank Regiment on the 28th of August, 1939, the 38th Tank Battalion was formed. In total, as of the 10th of May, 1940, the infantry had 98 tanks, but later 10 more of this type were transferred from the cavalry. The new tanks were first shown publicly at the traditional parade on the 14th of July, 1938 in Paris. Overall, the new machines turned out to be more successful in design than the Renault R35, though they also had their drawbacks. In addition to the obvious problems with armament, which only grew as the armor thickness of enemy tanks increased, there were other shortcomings as well. The tank's mobility remained insufficient for cavalry use. This fact eventually led to the creation of a tank that was officially adopted on the 18th of February, 1939, under the designation Light Tank Model 1935, Modification 1939. Equipped with a 120 horsepower engine, the vehicle, better known as the Hotchkiss H35, became significantly more mobile, approaching the level of its single-turret counterparts. This model became the most successful French light tank, which predetermined its long service life. Meanwhile, the earlier version was gradually improved during operation. The first important improvement was the installation of radio stations. It is often said that Soviet tanks were supposedly deaf compared to their foreign counterparts. But in reality, out of roughly 10,000 T-26 tanks, which were direct analogs of the French Hotchkiss H35, more than a third were equipped with radios, specifically 3,958 vehicles. French light tanks, on the other hand, initially had no radios at all. Only later, during service, were radios installed, and mostly only on the tanks of platoon commanders. Another problem was the small size of the tank. It turned out that because of this, it could not cross wide trenches and ditches. Therefore, in 1939, a special tail device was developed, similar to the one used on Renault FT tanks. The work was carried out as part of a competition. Besides Hotchkiss, the AMX company also tested its own design, but it proved less effective. As a result, the Hotchkiss tail device was chosen. It was mainly installed on the new Hotchkiss H39 model, but it was also added to older H35s that underwent major repairs and modernization. The final major modernization took place in 1940. It had been clear from the start that the 37mm SA-18 gun was outdated, but due to lack of funds, it was impossible to install a fundamentally new weapon. Only in February 1940 did production of the long-barreled 37mm SA-38 guns begin. At a distance of 1,640 feet, it could penetrate an armor plate 0.9 inches thick set at a 30-degree angle. And at a distance of about 984 to 1,312 feet, it could penetrate a vertically mounted plate 1.2 inches thick. This allowed it to engage German medium tanks. German tanks, in turn, could penetrate the armor of the Hotchkiss H35 and other French light tanks from a distance of about 984 feet or less. Some H-35s received the new guns, but they appeared far too late. By May 1940, the 25th Motorized Division joined the units equipped with Hotchkiss H-35 tanks, where they became part of the 5th Reconnaissance Group of Infantry Divisions. 16 tanks were assigned there. The tanks of the 1st and 2nd Mechanized Divisions were the first to use their Hotchkiss H-35s in combat, and this happened almost simultaneously on May 13, 1940. The 2nd Mechanized Division fought in Belgium, taking an active part in the battles for the city of Anneux, where the H-35s mostly supported Saumur S-35 tanks. The 1st Mechanized Division fought in the Netherlands, where the Hotchkiss H-35s performed well, although their opponents were mostly German infantry units. Soon, however, the retreat began under the pressure of German forces. The reliance on heavy armor proved partially mistaken, as it quickly became clear that at close range and fights at distances of 656 to 984 feet were common. the cast armor, 1.6 inches thick, could be penetrated by German 37mm anti-tank guns. As a result, both French mechanized divisions suffered heavy losses rather quickly. After a week and a half of fighting, the 1st Mechanized Division existed only on paper, while the Hotchkiss tanks of the 2nd Mechanized Division took part in the Battle of Arras. The final battles of the original divisions took place near Dunkirk. Afterwards, both divisions were reorganized, but by June 1940, it was all over. The 13th Tank Battalion entered combat on May 15, 1940. It should be noted that during the first weeks of the campaign, the battalion had to move around a lot, first transferring from place to place and then retreating. A similar situation occurred with the 38th Tank Battalion. Gradually losing tanks, on May 26th, both battalions, or rather what remained of them, met in the commune of Warhem in northern France. By early June, they were in the Dunkirk area. Overall, the tanks within the battalions did not distinguish themselves much, but the issue lay not so much with the H35s themselves as with the general state of the French forces. Since the Hotchkiss H35s were part of the forward units, they suffered heavy losses rather quickly. Due to high losses, very few functional tanks of this type fell into German hands. Moreover, the Germans already possessed a large number of Hotchkiss H39s, which seemed a much better option. Therefore, these tanks almost completely disappeared from the battlefield. Today, only one preserved tank of this type is known. The vehicle, marked with the number 11 on its turret, was left on a beach near the town of Camiers. Later, its turret was removed and used to reinforce a bunker. According to the latest reports, the tank was supposedly recovered from the beach. There is hope that the only surviving Hotchkiss H35 will someday be restored and presented to us as a complete tank.